Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and good afternoon and good evening to our friends who are tuning in from around the world. My name is John Allen. I'm the president of the Brookings Institution, and it is a great pleasure to welcome you all today to the second day of the programming of our conference, The Middle East and the New U.S. Administration. I am truly delighted to welcome our first speaker today, His Excellency President Barham Salih of Iraq. After a distinguished career as a public servant in the Kurdistan regional government in Iraq, and then later in Iraqi national politics, President Salih was elected to be president by the Iraqi Congress, the Iraqi Parliament, on October 2nd, 2018. And I have to say, from my own experience in the region, which is going on a couple of decades, he is widely considered to be a prominent regional leader, and his voice is recognized around the world. So we are truly honored to have the president with us today. And among his many accomplishments before taking office, President Salih founded the American University of Iraq, Sulaymaniyah. And I would like to take note that the university hosts an excellent think tank with which we've had interaction over the years, the Institute for Regional and International Studies. And I'm delighted to share the screen with someone who's shown such a commitment to education and to fostering policy experts and expertise necessary for the functioning of the democratic process, not just in Iraq, but in the region and around the world. President Salih, thank you for joining us this morning. And before I go to questions, let me just tell the audience of a quick memory that I have of our interaction. The year was 2007, very difficult time in Iraq. I was stationed in the Al-Anbar province in the west, which, as you remember, sir, was a very violent time. And our efforts were trying to bring the provinces back into the government in Baghdad. You were the deputy prime minister and had been a powerful voice for the reunification of Iraq. And in early September, you led a delegation from Baghdad to Al-Ramadi, the provincial capital of Al-Anbar. And in the provincial council chamber, your leadership that day did more, I think, to end the fighting in Al-Anbar than almost any others. And sitting in that full room, along that long table, the room was full of the citizens of Al-Anbar. You sat at the end of that table and directed the leadership of Baghdad and your own personal leadership in changing the dynamic. And with you at the end of that table was our great ambassador, Ryan Crocker, was the great tribal leader of the Sahwa, Sheikh Abdul Sattar Abu Risha, but also sitting next to you was the senior senator from Delaware, Joe Biden. And who would have imagined 15 years later, here we are. But sir, thank you for your leadership then. It was profound at that moment. And thank you for your leadership today, President Salih. Sir, what I'd like to do is begin with our first question. And if you have any recollections, you're welcome to offer it then. Yeah. You're now the president. For our American audiences, it would be very powerful for us to learn from you how you describe your role as president today and what, sir, are your priorities? This is a critical moment in Iraq. I couldn't be happier than to see you as president. What are your priorities now for the country and the region, sir?
Thank you, General, and thank you for this wonderful opportunity and to be able to see you after so many years. I remember that important meeting. And for us also from Iraq to see President Biden looking at the situation across the Middle East and the world, and speaking yesterday to our Prime Minister and focusing on the need for supporting Iraq through the difficult transitions that we have been condemned to because of so many years of conflict and difficulties, it's reassuring. I also remember your leadership, General. You were commanding the Marine forces in Anbar at that time, and Anbar was a devastated war zone. I was a while back in Fallujah, and I was quite amazed at the level of reconstruction and normalcy that I see in Fallujah today compared to those times past. So if anything about the story of Iraq, a story of turmoil, story of conflict, unfortunately, but also commitment to reconstruction and moving on and trying to make what could be this country in terms of prosperity and hopefully peace and stability. You asked me quite a difficult question about my role as president in a country like Iraq. We have a constitution that defines certain responsibilities to the president. We have a parliamentary system. The president is charged with observing the Constitution and commitment of the government and other state institutions to the Constitution. And I can understand that could be a vague definition of what a responsibility of a president in a country like Iraq could be. But I can assure you this is most important, because this country to moving from days of dictatorship and tyranny and war and conflict to one of constitutional government is an awesome responsibility that I shoulder today. At the moment, we are working with our Prime Minister, with our Parliament and others to making sure that we get to the next elections, because essentially Iraq from 2003 has been defined as a parliamentary democracy. We have had a lot of demonstrations and protests in Iraq in the last year. One of the demands of the protesters was to go for early elections, which we hope to have in October this year. And we are working with the United Nations and others, and including our international partners, to helping Iraqis enjoy a reasonably free and fair elections, and making sure that Iraqis will have a chance at electing a representative government that will see to the reforms needed after decades of conflict and problems in this country.
Sure, the challenges are not insignificant. And I couldn't be happier than that you are the president at this particular moment. Let me take you back just slightly in history. You wrote in 2017 an op-ed in Financial Times in which you described a need for a new security and economic architecture in the Middle East, a transformation based on shared economic interests and empowerment. So could you describe your thoughts and what initial steps the region and the international community ought to undertake to achieve a consensus-driven regional order?
I think the Middle East, certainly for the last 40 years, at least since the Iraq-Iran war, 4 decades of conflict that has engulfed this part of the world, have swept across the Middle East. We have had the Iraq-Iran war, we had the Kuwait invasion by Saddam, we had the 2003 war in Iraq that oversaw the removal of Saddam Hussein. We have seen the emergence of terrorism in the most violent form, and certainly ISIS were the last manifestation of this. This part of the world is in deep, deep state of disrepair, requires really being put back together. We definitely need a regional order. From my vantage point here in Baghdad, I do see restoration of a strong sovereign state of Iraq a key component of a stable order in the Middle East. Iraq in the past 4 decades has been the domain of many conflicts, has been the domain of proxy wars of different regional and international actors. We are trying to promote the idea of a sovereign Iraq as being the common interest between our neighbors across the Middle East. That means Iran, that means Turkey, that means the Arab world. Iraq, for its diversity, for its geopolitics, can offer an area in which these various actors can come together, and instead of actually fighting the proxy wars across our land and maintain the state of conflict, whether active or passive, it's time to be put to rest. And we should be focusing on building economic integration, infrastructure work that binds the region together. And if this could happen in Europe after 2 devastating world wars, why not in the Middle East, which has not seen the level of conflict that we have seen in Europe in the 20th century? I think Iraq with its resources, Iraq with its geopolitics, and the stakes that are involved in the case of Iraq, it genuinely can become a common interest of the various actors in the region as well as the international community. And I also want to focus on the need of making Iraq a success as a common interest in order to defeat definitively notions of extremism and terrorism that have swept not just the Middle East, but across the world throughout the last 2-3 decades.
Well, it is a central feature and has been for so many years, and we hope it can become again. So in that context, can you talk about how might we promote this regional integration? And more broadly, given Jordan and Egypt's ties with the GCC, What does Iraq's relationship with these two states mean in the context of its relationship to the GCC? And what might the United States be able to do to facilitate closer ties in that region?
I remember in 2003, many in the United States, as well as in Iraq, were stating that we need an Iraq that is at peace with itself and at peace with its neighbors. And again, if we reflect back on the history of at least since Saddam Hussein gained power in Iraq, Iraq has been a source of trouble for many of its neighbors, for across the region and for the world for that matter. And basically, I think the world has a vital interest in making sure that Iraq's transition succeeds. Iraq can only succeed if it is fully sovereign and independent. Iraq cannot be a satellite state to any of its neighbors. Iraq cannot be subjugated to the whims of others. Otherwise, other actors will also get involved. And Iraq could be a zone of influence for some, but it ends up being a quagmire for others, including its own people. After decades of this conflict, again, making sure Iraq is stable and representing no threat to its population first and foremost, but also to its neighbors, it's a good base to start from. In terms of the international community, this idea of the neighbors of Iraq being brought into a regional order that will be focused on respecting Iraq's sovereignty and independence, I think it's a good starting point. Of course, there are many other issues involved in this part of the world. I'm not saying that it is all about Iraq, but I can say that Iraq is a vital country with focus on its sovereignty and its independence. We really may be able to transform the discourse that exists across this neighborhood. I want to tell you about, for example, Syria, which is a vital conflict as well that is afflicting us in Iraq, afflicting the world, whether it is to do with the humanitarian consequences of this war, whether it is because of the security implications of this conflict. Stabilizing Iraq and helping the situation in Syria is important. Stabilizing Iraq will also mean lesser conflict with the Turks, with the Iranians, and can bring about an area where a genuine conversation could really start on what is common for the neighborhood, namely defeating terrorism, defeating extremism, and also working on issues of infrastructure, of economic integration, the real issue that is facing the nations of the Middle East as a whole, job opportunities for our young people. You mentioned Egypt and Jordan. In this context, I want to assure you that Iraq, over the past couple of years, have been working very hard with our Jordanian neighbors, with our Egyptian partners to developing a range of economic and political, and for that matter, even security collaboration, because the interests that binds these countries together are huge. In the past year or so, we have been working very hard to developing our relations with the GCC. We just had our foreign minister and our minister of interior in Saudi Arabia. We're developing these relationships to the maximum. I do not say that there are these will be easy, because there are many, many obstacles along the way, but Iraq is committed to working to this end. And I want to also say that our Arab neighbors in general have been embracing Iraq's transition, embracing Iraq's progress, at least over the last couple of years, and I hope that we can continue with that. We very much hope that our unique relationship with the Iranians can also help bring about a better regional order, and making sure that this security order, this political order, this economic order that the Middle East desperately needs could be brought about, with Iraq being at the center of it. Stability in Iraq is good for Iraqis, definitely, but it is also good for the Middle East.
Well, you took us on a tour of the entire region, and we can only conclude from your last response that Iraq and the future of Iraq, the stability of Iraq and its people, touches almost every dimension of the Middle East, from the Gulf Coordination Council, obviously, to Jordan, to Egypt, relationships with Turkey, Syria, and Iran. And this conference is about the new administration, the Biden administration. And of course, you know President Biden well. We've recently seen some very interesting developments with respect to the administration's interest in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with regard to Iran, and a public announcement that the United States and Iran are going to talk about hostages. So there's a very interesting dimension to this. But closer to the bilateral relationship, we know that obviously from the time of our withdrawal from Iraq in 2011, and then our return with respect to the Islamic State and trying to help Iraq to defeat that terrible scourge, we now find ourselves both in the United States and in Iraq with loud voices being raised about the departure of U.S. forces and a minimizing potentially of the bilateral relationship. As we embark on a new administration, which I know is thinking hard about its relationship with Iraq and Afghanistan and other places, how do you see, President Salih, how do you see the response to the Americans and to the Iraqis on the future of the bilateral relationship and the presence of Americans in Iraq?
General, first and foremost, the war against terror and against these extremist groups is most important. There has been a major success accomplished against ISIS.
Yes.
The Iraqi territories that ISIS were controlling have been liberated. Many of the displaced people have returned. And this was in no small measure an easy victory. It was done because of the commitment and the sacrifices of the Iraqi forces, Iraqi populations, but also in a critical way because of the support of our friends and our international partners, the international coalition. This was an important victory. It is a territorial victory. It is a military victory. But you, from your own past experience representing the international coalition to defeat ISIS, know that this is not entirely accomplished because there remains pockets of these terrorists across the Middle East, particularly in Syria. You look at Idlib, you look at some of the other areas, and we are already witnessing signs of the revival of some of the activities by ISIS in the Iraqi deserts, near Mosul, in Anbar, sometimes in Kirkuk, and so on. My point is, while I do not want to underestimate the significance of the victory accomplished, but we have to acknowledge also that the mission is yet to be accomplished fully and definitively. And without addressing some of the fundamental issues like the Syrian conflict, like dealing with these pockets and areas of the presence of these extremist groups, this war against terror, whatever the term is, whatever the proper term these days are, will have to continue. Iraq definitely is committed to retaining its full sovereignty. Neither the United States nor Iraq want to have foreign troops or American troops, for that matter, across its territory. The US administrations have all called for the withdrawal or removing troops, but all of us are also committed to maintaining the fight to the end against ISIS. There is a decision by Iraqi parliament on this issue. This is being talked about in the context of our strategic dialogue with the United States, which is ongoing. And yesterday, President Biden, in his conversation with our Prime Minister, has reaffirmed as an important framework for the bilateral relationship between Iraq and the United States. This matter about the presence of coalition forces in Iraq will be discussed in that context and in accordance with the needs of Iraqis, and for that matter, the international community, to making sure that ISIS will not have an opportunity to resurface again and to present a threat, not just to Iraqi peace, but also to regional and international peace. There is now also focus on NATO, enhancing its mission in Iraq to provide training to Iraqi forces. At the end of the day, the right model will be to improve Iraqi capabilities, to depend on ourselves, to have the support of our friends, but at the end of the day, for us and our forces to be doing the job on their own.
Well, as someone who was on the ground almost immediately after the invasion of the Islamic State back in 2014, I have to say, to endorse what you've just said, that while America and the international community was committed to helping Iraq, the courage and the fighting that was done to defeat that terrible scourge was born on the backs of the Iraqi people. And so the success of that fighting is the Iraqi success. And if the international community could help, we were proud and glad to be able to support. But as you say, Mr. President, it's not over. And I think the connection with the international coalition is still very important going forward, as well as you said, the connection ultimately to NATO. And I think that's a very wise relationship to promote. Now, Mr. President, you mentioned, yes, sir. Please.
If I may, in the same context, at the end of the day, the military component is important, is vital, cannot be underestimated, but without addressing the regional dynamics, and this is where I talk about the regional order, unless the neighborhood as a whole collaborates, cooperates fully and definitively to face up to the challenge of extremism and these terrorist groups across the Middle East, we will continue to have episodes of this problem. This has to be a collective international and regional responsibility. In this context, addressing the conflict in Syria, hopefully ending this conflict and this humanitarian catastrophe that has unfolded before our eyes over the last few years in Syria is vital, and it has to be focused on removing these terrorist and extremist groups that are still operating in certain areas of Syria and terrorizing their population, as well as posing a threat to our neighborhood, including Iraq.
So let me interpret for the audience what you just said in an American context. The United States in this new administration has to have a regional security policy. And it has to address the entirety of the region, not have a series of individual relationships or individual policies. It has to flow from a strategic vision of the region. And very importantly, to your point, Mr. President, there has to be American leadership in solving these matters in partnership with our friends in the region, in particular with Iraq.
General, I hear almost in the United States and in other parts of the world, many times that people are getting tired of the Middle East. We are getting tired of the conflict that has engulfed our part of the world. Enough is enough.
Of course. And
when you look at Iraq and the wasted years and the lives and the resources that have been wasted on conflict after conflict, 40 years, 4 decades of almost continuous conflict. When you look at Syria, when you look at so many other parts of the Middle East, it's tiring, it's enough. People need jobs, people need education, people need healthcare, people need really effective measures. You and I have been talking for the last 20 minutes or so, and the word COVID has not come up in relations to the problems of the Middle East. It is a serious, serious problem with the debilitated health infrastructure, whether in Iraq or across the region, and in many parts of the region, to say the least. This region needs fundamental changes and fundamental reforms and fundamental reorientation towards the priorities that any normal society needs. So my point is, you cannot, we would like obviously to change these things, and we are the people of this part of the world, we have the ultimate responsibility for this, but the world often wants to look the other way, only to be dragged back into states of conflict in this part of the world. This has happened so many times. And the situation in Syria, again, I go back to it because we talked about ISIL, but I also care about the humanitarian dynamics of Syria and more than 1 million kids born in refugee camps. It's just mind-boggling in the 21st century for this to happen. The world cannot walk away. This is an incubator for extremism that will be facing Europe, facing the United States, facing us in the neighborhood. We need to work together, and definitely, as you say, and as I've said, it has to be a regional approach. I wish Iraq was an island in the Pacific. It is not. It's part of this neighborhood. And in the case of Iraq, is also why Iraq is key to this. In Iraq, you have Shias and Sunnis. You have Kurds and Arabs. You have obviously an indigenous Christian community and multi-faith society. You have Iran to your east. You have the Arab world to there. You have Turkey and the gate to Europe. The geopolitics and the culture and the history of this place really makes it the catalyst for a lot of transformations across the Middle East. My point again, I don't want to pose to you a rosy picture about Iraq. Iraq is still in much difficulty. The transition in Iraq is painful. And for you and many others, many other friends in the United States and elsewhere, the transition in Iraq has been not entirely satisfying, to say the least, if not disappointing. Iraqis deserve better. Iraqis themselves are disappointed that they have not acquired the quality of life that they deserved after decades of dictatorship and tyranny and so on. But as we have shown over the past year, 2 years and so on, of protest movement, changes of government through constitutional forms and so on, the level of debate within this society about the need for reform, the many new movements that are emerging asking for a change of direction, it gives me hope that Iraq can change and can be better, and genuinely so. Iraq could be a catalyst for something better across the Middle East. And that's why I call for focus on Iraq and supporting Iraq's transition towards what we hope to be a genuine democracy, a stable country, at peace with itself and at peace with its neighbors.
Your call could not be more important, and it couldn't be clearer. The world has to see the future of Iraq and the region in the context of resolving the base causal factors that creates this constant instability. And if we only see Iraq and the region through a security lens, then it'll always be a security problem. We have to see beyond that lens. We have to think about the stability of the people, the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of the states, and solving the humanitarian crises. Your call is so extraordinarily important right now, and I know the administration is listening to this. Sir, closer to home, where you are today, we've witnessed, and you've mentioned it a couple of times, we've witnessed some real instability in the streets, protests, significant protests. Could you take us through a little bit about what has caused that? In some respects, protests are a positive signal that the people themselves are seeking change, or they're seeking reform. But sadly, there were casualties in the streets, there were killings, people are seeking justice. Could you give us a little on what is the source of that protest, and what types of reform might be embraced by Iraq to address it, sir?
I mean, obviously, one thing, and you are a witness to that as well from your previous tenure in Iraq. In 2003, Saddam Hussein was removed from power. We put in place a new constitutional order, a parliamentary system of government. Now is almost 17, 18 years after that constitution. I will tell you, and from my vantage point as President of the Republic, and having served in this government in previous positions as well, Iraqis realize and expect a lot of changes to this constitutional order. They don't find it delivering what they need in terms of good governance. Ultimately, what is lacking in Iraq is good governance. I mean, I don't want to compare ourselves to the era of Saddam Hussein or to other countries, but I can tell you that Iraqis and the Iraqi population, now nearly 38 million or so, with half of it below the age of 19, a young population, they are seeking better economic opportunities. They are seeking better governance that can take on corruption that is rampant, that was associated with decades of conflict and years of conflict against terrorism and so on. Iraqis want a stronger state that is able to control arms and not to have armed groups outside the state. Iraqis expect, in my view, a new generation of political leaders, and they speak about it openly, and the protest movement has been quite vocal about this. And it was remarkable last year, I mean, the protest movement in so many ways, capturing the mood of the nation, demanding reforms, demanding change of government, and demanding also free and fair elections, because they, and for good reason, had many issues with the electoral system and the fraud and manipulation of the electoral system that has happened in our country. These were the fundamental demands of the Iraqi protest movement. Many of the political elite of the country now acknowledge these demands to be legitimate, are going to compete in elections. And I hope that the next elections, as I said, will be free and fair. And we will make sure that they will be so, whether through the various measures that we are taking on board within Iraq, but also to the international assistance that we are seeking from the United Nations, to making sure that the elections will offer Iraqis a democratic way to decide their own future. At the end of the day, General, Iraqis, like Americans, like other nations, want jobs, want better schools, want better healthcare service. They want cleaner government and more efficient government. At the moment, the present-day government can claim it is doing better than its previous government, but Iraqis deserve better and want better. And that's the essence of the struggle in Iraq.
Yes, sir. And from my own experience, working with and loving Iraqis as I do, they also want a brighter future for their children. Mm-hmm. And that hopefully is on the horizon with your leadership and the committed leadership to the people now. A couple of other quick questions, sir, and then we'll go to the audience for just the final few minutes that we have. The 2021 federal budget discussion that occurred in the parliament revealed that there are still differences between Baghdad and Erbil in the KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government. Why do you believe that's still the case, given all that has transpired, and when we've had such prominent and senior leadership coming out of the Kurdish region into broader Iraqi politics? Are we seeing those differences diminish over time? Will they ever end?
Wallahi, on this matter, General, on the issue of the budget, I am more hopeful than, say, 2 weeks ago that we are closing the gap and that we may have now a compromise formula before Parliament that hopefully will be voted on. I mean, obviously, this is Iraq and this is Parliament, and we have God knows how many members of Parliament. Each one has a different opinion. And this is, what we've asked for, a parliamentary system of democracy. And there is a lot of debate. But according to the data before me and the consultations that I have made with parliamentary bloc leaders, we are a lot closer than, say, 2 weeks ago. And I'm a bit more hopeful. But in terms of the relationship between the Kurds and Baghdad, this has been a perennial problem for the Iraqi state. This has been a problem for Iraq as a nation. What type of nation we are? Are we a centralizing authoritarian government, or are we a federal democracy? Obviously, the constitution defines Iraq's character to be that of a federal democracy, but the statement and the reality of it leaves a lot to be worked on, put it that way. At the heart of this issue is the issue of resources. Kurdistan sells oil. Baghdad says, I cannot give you budget unless you give me the oil. At the moment, the formula, the compromise formula that is before Parliament is that KRG, Kurdistan, will offer 250,000 barrels of oil of production a day to Baghdad, and Baghdad will assume the budgetary responsibilities for Kurdistan. But this is not entirely fully defined yet. It is still subject to conversations and so on. My hope is after the next elections, Kurdistan and Baghdad will, and the various representatives of the Iraqi communities, we will be sitting around a conversation to really say the type of relationship we have so far has not been entirely satisfying, neither to Arab Iraqis nor to Kurds, whether it is on the issue of budget, on the issue of power sharing, and so on. We do have a problem. There is need for dialogue. There is need to redefining some of the ambiguous issues in the constitution for this country to be able to move forward. This perennial issue of Kurds and its relationship with Baghdad needs to be resolved in a much more meaningful way. 2003, we put together the constitution. It was during very unique times. After 17 years, we need to review some of these provisions to making sure that this episodal disputes between KRG and Baghdad is resolved in a much more permanent way.
Very good. Well, let's hope it is. And I think the conditions are in place, or at least moving in that direction to find that solution. Interestingly, Mr. President, Pope Francis is going to be visiting Iraq in early March. And
5th of March, sir.
Sorry?
5th of March.
Wonderful. We understand it is his intent to visit Najaf. And of course, that is the center of Shiaism. As we go forward, this is really an important visit, but it signals many things. And it signals the future of Iraq's capacity with the Shia and the Sunni and the Kurds and other minorities to work together. What's your view on that, sir? I know you welcome the Pope's visit, but what are your thoughts on the future in that regard, sir?
I had the honor of meeting His Holiness the Pope twice, and every time he was so concerned about Iraq and concerned for Iraq, and was very keen on visiting Mesopotamia and visiting Ur, where Abraham was born. And remember, General, all divine religions are derived from Abraham. And essentially the message of the Pope and the message of Iraq, for that matter, should be not in the name of Abraham, not in the name of God, not in the name of religion, this extremism and killing. So the visit is quite significant, historic, and we are all excited about it. Muslims are more excited about it than others, perhaps. It is quite a powerful statement, especially His Holiness' visit is the first after the COVID pandemic and so on. His visit to Najaf is also most significant. Ayatollah Sistani has played a crucial role over the years in making sure that Iraq retains civil discourse and protects minorities and be a center of moderation that I'm talking about. So in a way, I don't look at Najaf as being just a Shia issue. I'm a Kurd, and Najaf historically has spoken in support of Kurdish rights and preventing dictators in Baghdad from attacking Kurds. Najaf has spoken historically in support and protection of Christians and other minorities like Yazidis who have been brutalized by ISIS and others. The meeting between the Pope and Ayatollah Sistani will represent a very profound statement about moderation in religion, and also the statement, not in the name of God. These terrorists, these extremists, these bigots cannot invoke the name of God and the name of Abraham, our forefather of prophets, as we say in Arabic, they cannot speak for that. That will be quite a historic meeting. I will be honored, in fact, to receiving the Pope in this building here at Baghdad Palace. I wish that you could come as well, be joining us. But that is quite a historic visit, and we are all excited about it. And it will be a message of peace, tolerance, and what Iraq is about. Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, the cradle of religions. We need to be together, peaceful coexistence, united against terror, united against extremism. And really, we should all be brought together by this message.
What a powerful words you have just given us, Mr. President. That's a great message and a terrific image, and the moment of the meeting of the Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani.
That would be a moment of history.
Oh, it will be, because actually both of them were quite helpful to us in the global coalition. His Eminence, the Grand Ayatollah, was that voice that you talked about of moderation, but of Iraqi unity in the face of a terrible invasion by the Islamic State. And when I met with the Vatican in my capacity as the special envoy, the Vatican leadership was very committed to the security of all Iraqis, regardless of their religion or confession. And of course, the Christian community in Iraq is one of the oldest in the world. It still speaks Aramaic, the original language of Christianity. So it is the cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia, and the visit of His Eminence the Pope with Ali al-Sistani, the Grand Ayatollah, will be a critical moment. I wish I could join you, sir.
And he will be going to Nineveh. This was the battlefield, epic battlefield against ISIS. Yes, and for the Christian communities to have revived. And we still have a long way to go, by the way, for the Christians hopefully to return back to their homeland after decades of persecution by these extremists and these decades of conflict and so on. And that is also quite a signal. This part of the world thrives on its pluralism, thrives on its diversity. Christians are an indigenous part of our culture and our history and our land across the Middle East. These extremists that want, in the name of religious purity or whatever it is, to drive them out, this is not something against Christians. This is against every Muslim, every citizen of this part of the world. Again, Ur, where Abraham came through with his message, is the place that unites us all, not in the name of God, not in the name of Abraham. We are all united in our humanity and in our belief in the divine values of religion in terms of tolerance and peace. And hopefully the visit is quite an opportunity, not just for Iraqis, but for the world at large.
Very well said, sir. Thank you so much for that message to us and to the audience today. Sir, I have a question, the first question from the audience, if I may. As seen in the so-called Arab Spring and other recent protests across the region, as we just discussed, as in Iraq in 2019, everyday people across the Middle East and North Africa, now tied together on the internet, tied together through social media, wield significant political power that they didn't 25 years ago. And when they have the capacity now using these digital platforms to organize collectively, they've reshaped the dynamics in many countries, profoundly reshaped it in many countries, but profoundly across the entire region. As you look out across the region, not just at Iraq, but across the region, as you said so many times to us this morning, how do you think about engaging these grassroots movements? You know, sometimes this is called the Arab street. It's not a good term, frankly, but these grassroots movements in all of these countries are tied together in ways we could not have imagined before. How do you, sir, as a regional leader, not just an Iraqi leader, think about engaging these movements as we go forward?
Well, General, the world is changing, and it's changing very, very fast. Perhaps you feel it also in the United States, not perhaps, for sure. And the events over the last few months also, the impact of social media, the impact of these social and political changes amplified by technology is quite profound. In our case, in the Middle East, technology is becoming part of our day-to-day lives. And with weaknesses of states across the region and our inability to respond fully and definitively to the aspirations of our younger population, is a major, major challenge. My focus remains on education as a key catalyst for improving people's lives and making sure that our future is different from our past. And you mentioned kindly the American University that I'm very proud of. The impact of education is crucial on the young population, but coupled with that, will have to be economic reforms, will have to be jobs, jobs, jobs. Without jobs and meaningful jobs for our younger population that are getting into the economy, our societies will be faced with lots of social upheavals. I mean, the story of the Arab Spring in some ways, obviously, is a lot to do with lack of good governance, lack of democratic systems of governments across the Middle East, but fundamentally is about young people who are denied opportunities to work meaningfully in their societies. The major challenge before Iraq, before the neighborhood as a whole, not just Iraq, by the way, all our neighbors, is that of creating opportunities for our growing populations, our young populations. At the moment, they are a challenge, but they should be turned around to an opportunity. This youth bulge across the region should be harnessed to creating more economic activity. From my vantage point, it has to be done through infrastructure work across the Middle East, connecting our economies instead of us wasting our resources, precious resources, on proxy wars and senseless conflicts. We should really be more focused on creating these kind of infrastructure work that connects our economies, integrates our economies, create interdependencies, make us more united against extremism, but at the same time, creating opportunities for our younger population who desperately needs jobs, who desperately needs better quality of life and better education.
Mr. President, associated with that, you've mentioned this a couple of times this morning. I wanted to get your sense on how COVID has impacted Iraq, but also impacted the region, and your sense on vaccine distribution. This is just critical to our being able to move beyond this disease to address those fundamental problems that you've touched on.
It is a major problem. And in the case of Iraq, because of, again, decades of conflict, mismanagement, corruption, you name it, unfortunately, our health sector has been somewhat, more than somewhat challenged dealing with this pandemic. I have to say, social networks and many other activities that social movements have done have helped the society deal with this. Obviously now, at the moment, our situation is quite difficult because we are going through the second wave of COVID. Today, I was speaking with our health officials. We had about 4,000 infections today. In total, we had more than 13,000 dead, unfortunately, too many. Some people say compared to some of our neighbors, we have done better, but this is not my comparison and this should not be my standard. According to our health officials today and the government, we should be getting the first batches of vaccine in about a week time. Like many other societies, the distribution, I'm sure, will be challenging, but we're trying to mobilize, and the government, the Prime Minister has been pushing hard to mobilize on this front. And making sure that Iraqis will get the vaccines needed. There are some legal issues involved. I was just told about it, that some of these vaccine makers demand a law that will have to be ratified by Parliament to ensure that there is immunity for them and so on. They're working on this matter, but these are the kind of challenges that I wanted to impart to you on this front.
Well, we certainly hope for a quick restoration of the health of the people of Iraq, and the vaccine distribution is very good news, sir. Sir, we just have a couple of moments left. May I ask if you have a single message that you'd like to have us consider as we end this wonderful conversation today? Not just a message for the American audience, but a message for the world. What would it be, sir?
General, we live in an interconnected world. Our security and your security, your well-being and our well-being are very much intertwined. We may all want to pretend that we are afar, but at the end of the day, General Allen came all the way from the United States to work with his young men and women in uniform in Anbar during those difficult times and trying to make it happen. And our success is your success and vice versa. At the end of the day, there is a shared responsibility. In the case of Iraq, we are in charge. We are responsible for our nation. We have to have the priority of this, but we need the support of our friends. And I know we have many friends in the United States. President Biden and his team are well known to us. They know Iraq well. The stakes are high in Iraq. I cannot tell you that we are beyond the dangers. We still have serious, serious challenges, but we're determined to make it. our friends in the United States and in the international community should be with us as we try to make it.
Well, I think all the indications are very positive that certainly the American people are with you and with the Iraqi people. And this administration is wise. And I think its relationship to Iraq will only improve over the next 4 years, sir. I cannot tell you I can't tell you how greatly honored we are this morning that you were able to join us to hear once again your words of wisdom coming to us in the United States through the platform of the Brookings Institution. You are always welcome here, sir. And when the conditions change and you have the chance to visit Washington again, we would love to host you here. In the meantime, sir, we wish you good health and safety for you and your family and all the Iraqi people.
Same for you, sir.
Joining us today, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.